Thank you so much, George, for that generous introduction. Well, before I go into the intricacies of my talk, let me preface my presentation with a few highlights. So number one, as people living in this world, we are constantly confronted by new things almost on a daily basis. Let's take the ICT sector, for example. The information, communication, and technology sector has had tremendous strides in terms of technology advancement. And one good example is the smartphone. With a smartphone, nowadays, anyone can access internet anywhere, anyhow. But that is just the ICT sector. There are other innovations that actually don't get adopted. So if you look like the genetically modified foods that could dramatically reduce malnutrition in growing children, they don't get adopted for different social, cultural, and economic reasons. In many cases, conservation is poorly adopted. But if we think of conservation as an innovation, and perhaps it is because it is a new idea in many places, then probably we could study it in the context of how ideas spread or don't. And it is from that possibility that I came up with the study to look at the diffusion of gear-based conservation innovation in coral reef fisheries. Now, when we talk of adoption of new ideas or products, it is important to point out that individuals vary in their willingness to accept risks and adopt new ideas or products. While the early adopters would quickly adopt new innovations ahead of everyone else, the late adopters, on the other hand, would be reluctant and rather wait until other people have tried it first. So the question is, how can we determine who will take risks and who will not? How can we describe the processes that influence adoption or non-adoption? Now, to provide answers to these two fundamental questions, we need to thoroughly understand the diffusion of innovations theory. Well, this is a theory that seeks to explain how, why, and at what rate ideas spread through cultures. The theory was first studied by the French sociologist Gabriel Tandy in the late 19th century, followed by other anthropologists in the 1920s and 1930s. The theory basically took off in the subfield of rural sociology because agriculture at that time was advancing rapidly, and researchers started to examine how independent farmers were adopting hybrid seeds, equipments, and techniques. But it is Ryan and Gross in 1943 who solidified this work in their first ever publication on the adoption of hybrid corn in Iowa in the United States. Now, that paper was clearly agenda setting because it made this theory a distinct paradigm that would later be cited consistently. But fast forward, Alfred Rogers, a professor of communication studies, popularized this theory in his book, Diffusion of Innovation, first published in 1962. In his book, Rogers defines diffusion of innovations as the process by which innovations are communicated through certain channels over time among members of a social system. Now, it is important to point out that diffusion of innovation is a special type of communication concerned with the spread of messages that are perceived to be new. And therefore, any idea that is perceived to be new by an individual such that a decision can be made whether to adopt or reject is what is referred to as an innovation. Now, many studies that have been done under this theory actually address adoption and diffusion collectively. But in reality, these are two distinct paradigms. And while many adoption studies are keen on the factors that will determine uptake of innovations at any point in time, diffusion literature, on the other hand, distinguishes itself from adoption studies by focusing on the determinants of spread of innovations after its initial adoption. But however, both studies confirm that not all ideas spread at the same rate. As a matter of fact, some innovations spread more quickly than others. And the differences between adoption and diffusion rate can be explained clearly by these 5 characteristics. These differences can be explained in terms of relative advantage, which refers to the degree to which an innovation is believed to be better than the idea it supersedes, or in terms of compatibility, whether it is consistent with the existing values and the needs of the potential adopters, or in terms of complexity, how difficult or easy to use, or in terms of trialability, can it be experimented on a limited basis, or in terms of observability, whether its effects could be observed by others. Now, as I said before, adoption is highly differential. While other people will quickly adopt innovations, there are those individuals who have a tendency to follow behind. And Rogers classifies these groups of people into 5 main categories. You have the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. Now, differences in personality traits and socioeconomic status define the first 2 groups of early adopters, while differences in communication behavior classify the other 3 groups. And this makes adoption both a dichotomous and a continuous variable along which use intensifies with time. Now, it is important to put these 3 attributes into context because they are the same variables that would influence behavioral responses and decision-making processes in our societies. For example, entrepreneurs will tell you that self-confidence is the beginning of success in investment. Similarly, war veterans will tell you that battles are only won by risk-taking and self-confident warriors. Similarly, diffusion research also reveals that self-confidence and risk-taking characteristics affect an individual receptiveness to novel information as well as adoption of innovations. Again, if you take a general and kind of panoramic view of most of the social studies that have been done so far in the fisheries context, you will come to the conclusion that fishers are mostly influenced by their socio-economic status when reacting creatively to changing circumstances such as gear restrictions, closed sea zones, and closed areas. And if you come to diffusion research, you will also realize that socio-economic variables such as education, levels of income, account for more variance in the likelihood of an individual behavior to adopt innovations compared to social demographic variables such as age, gender, and religion. Another revelation is that the patterns of friendship play a critical role in the spread of innovation because they tend to minimize the risks and uncertainties associated with several innovations. Now, because innovations are mostly introduced to alter the existing conditions, there are consequences. And it is improper to assume that these consequences are normally desirable. These consequences can be both social and ecological. And the few studies that have analyzed innovation adoption consequences have actually revealed that they can be desirable or undesirable, unanticipated or anticipated, public or private, direct or indirect. And in many cases, these implications extend beyond an individual to include the entire social system and the environment. So in order to carry this theory to its logical conclusion, it is important to study diffusion of innovations on one hand, but also analyze the consequences of adoption both on people and the environment, because this will eventually determine whether people will maintain those innovations or not. Now, in summary, from this theory, we need to remember these 3 phases. The first phase is adoption of innovation, then the second one is diffusion of innovation, and the third one is innovation adoption consequences. Now, talking about consequences, let's take a moment and look at the fisheries, the coral reef fisheries. The subsector at the moment is in a state of a crisis. Stocks are declining, some species are getting extinct, there's overfishing everywhere, climate change is alive and well. The conservation theory that we all believe will reverse many of these adverse ecological impacts is fine. Nobody can deny the effectiveness of LPAs in protecting marine biodiversity and increasing biomass in our coral reefs. were it not for the turtle excluding devices and other bycatch reducing devices, we might not probably have the same number of turtles as we have currently. In fact, in some national regulations, in some countries, national regulations require people or fishers to adopt these turtle excluding devices. But tragically and unfortunately, some people won't comply with these initiatives for different social, cultural, and economic reasons. So it is incandescently clear that the problem is not conservation theory anymore, but rather the people. So perhaps we need to start thinking of conservation innovation initiatives as innovation. And that is exactly what my PhD is going to do. I am going to consider these marine conservation initiatives as innovations and use the diffusion of innovations theory to understand why people adopt. And beyond that, I will also analyze the impacts of these conservation initiatives both on people and the environment, because that will eventually determine whether people will maintain these innovations in the long run. Now, because nobody has thought of, has explored these factors influencing adoption and spread of marine conservation initiatives, particularly from developing countries, I came up with 2 questions to address this gap. And my first question would be my first chapter, and I will look at the factors that will determine the uptake of marine conservation initiatives. And number 2, I will look at the factors that will determine the spread of marine conservation initiatives. And to understand the implications of these initiatives, both on people and the environment, I came up with 2 other research questions. And the third one is, how does adoption of marine conservation initiatives impact people's well-being? And finally, how does adoption of these initiatives impact coral reef ecosystems? Now, let's take a moment and look at one emerging conservation innovation that is currently being advocated in several countries in Africa. The gated trap. This is a very simple, low-tech, low-cost innovation, and it's an award-winning innovation. And basically, a gated trap would allow small fish or juveniles or small-bodied fish to exit through the gates, but more importantly, retain the big fish that will fetch higher prices in the market, and let go of the other fish that are not desirable as food. The few experiments that have been done so far revealed that there was no difference in the target catch between the normal trap and the gated and the escape slope trap. But however, there was a reduction in the catch of functionally important herbivores that reduced by 56%. Bycatch also reduced by over 75%. There was a reduction of juvenile capture by 25%. But it was very difficult to enforce this innovation in other areas because actually fishermen incurred losses because there was no fish to catch. Although it is projected that profits will come afterwards, it's not yet confirmed. So it is assumed that this gear is very beneficial to the fisheries managers because it contributes to the agenda of protecting biodiversity and sustainability, but at the same time it is assumed not to be detrimental to the poor fishers because after all it retains the big fish that fishermen will want, and that is why it is being advocated in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean as a key conservation initiative. But we still don't know whether this gear will affect, we still don't know how this gear will affect fishers' well-being. Neither are we in a position to tell whether its catch will contribute to species vulnerability. And none of these assumptions will be true if nobody adopts this gear. And that is why I picked it as a lens through which I will study, I will conduct my study. Now, for my first chapter, I will look at adoption. What factors determine the uptake of escape slope traps? And here we look at the socio-economic status, personality traits, and communication behavior. I was very keen when I was selecting these variables because many of these variables have been tried and tested in developed countries, although my study will be based in a different setting altogether, and issues of poverty are very different. My second chapter, I will look at the communication behavior. what factors will determine the spread of innovation? And here I'll be looking at the patterns of friendship and social networks. Now, to do this, I will visit 6 fishing villages in Kenya, 4 experimental sites and 2 control sites. The sites have already been selected, and they represent the landing site with the highest number of basket trap fishers in Kenya. The other critical point is that these sites maintain a long-term cash monitoring program with local NGOs in Kenya. Now, in terms of experimental design, I will employ the before and after control impact assessment with multiple control sites and multiple treatment sites. I will draw a sample of not less than 30 fishers per fishing village, and I will track these individuals over 18 months period using semi-structured interviews with 6 months follow-up surveys in between. Now, after my second sampling period, I will look at the early adopters and the non-adopters of the escape slow trap. And after my third sampling period, then I will look at those early adopters, those individuals who maintain this gear, the early adopters who discard the gear, the late adopters, and the non-adopters. Now, to be specific on the personality attributes, I will look at age, taboos and beliefs, fishing experience, innovativeness, knowledge about escape slow traps, attitudinal traits, risk-taking traits, and well-being consideration. In terms of socio-economic status, I will look at education, exposure, cosmopolitness, which is the identification of individuals with the broader context. Then I will look at the material style of life, which is basically assets, household items, land, etc. Then I will look at occupational dependency, access to financial support. Then in terms of communication behavior, I will look at the general social behavior of individuals, decision-making roles, fishing networks, gear use social networks, fishing trade networks, and fishing information networks. It is important to re-emphasize here that these variables were derived and selected with very clear causal mechanisms. Now, just to elaborate on what communication behavior is all about, this is basically the social networks. And here we look at various centrality measures, see how individuals position themselves within networks, look at the homogeneity of individuals within networks, and see how bridges will influence or facilitate communication between individuals. I will look at how close networks are or individuals are, the size of networks. Then I will look at the personal network threshold, the number of friends that will eventually influence someone to change his or her behavior. Now, in terms of analysis, I will use the binary logistic regression model for chapter 1, because here I'm dealing with a binary variable, which is adoption or non-adoption. Then the classification regression trees will be used to visualize my dichotomous variables. For chapter 2, I will still employ the classification regression trees, because here I'm dealing with multiple ordinal variables. And this is a very good approach to deal with such situations. And the analysis of variance and redundancy analysis will be used to summarize my linear relationships between components of my explanatory response variables as explained by a set of my explanatory variables. Now, earlier on I talked about relative advantage. Okay, in the context of diffusion research, relative advantage is defined as the degree to which an innovation is perceived to be better than the idea it supersedes. Now, that degree can be measured in economic terms, but other factors such as social prestige, convenience, and satisfaction are also very important, and that constitutes human well-being. So here, the objective advantage of an innovation doesn't matter so much, but what does matter is whether individuals perceive that idea to be advantageous. So for my third chapter, I'm going to look at the relative advantage of escape slope traps on people's well-being. Yeah, but what is well-being? Many people think of well-being in terms of income or wealth, but honestly it goes beyond that. It encompasses other aspects of life, such as liberty, human dignity, and pursuit of happiness. Okay, in candid terms, well-being can be defined as the state of being comfortable, healthy, and happy. And it is not enough for us to understand well-being in all of its dimensions. It is not just enough to look at the material possession of assets, but we need also to recognize the social structures as either constraints or motivations, and also consider the relationships and processes that will be involved in achieving well-being. And that is how previous researchers have actually conceptualized well-being as a three-dimensional concept with material, subjective, and relational considerations. So this three-dimensional conceptual framework has already been applied in Kenya, and Abunge and others actually use this framework to determine the aspects of good life in Kenyan fishing villages, and they identified wealth, job, land, children, decision-making roles, relationships, blessings, and individual security as key aspects of living a good life in Kenya. So without considerable modifying the concept, I use their framing to derive my 8 aspects of well-being, which is income, material style of life, community relationships, supernatural relations, individual security, wealth satisfaction, job satisfaction, family provision concept. Just to give a general overview of how I'm going to address some of these things, I will look at the household items or facilities or land when I'm looking at material well-being. I will have to ask fishermen Likert scale questions to rate their relationships with supernatural beings for relational well-being. And then finally, I will use the same procedure of using Likert scale questions and ask fishers to rate their relationships, rate their level of satisfaction, either job-wise or wealth-wise, when it comes to subjective well-being. Again, here I will use the before and after control experiment as part of my experimental design, because there is a potential impact after adoption of this gear. And here I will compare impact between those who adopt and those who don't, between fishers in target villages who adopt and those in target villages who don't, and those in non-target villages at all. And here I will also track individual fishers 3 points in time with a baseline survey 6 months after and 12 months after. Now it is important to point out that here the idea of tracking individuals over time is what we call panel data. And this is extremely rare and gold standard in social science. The difference in difference analysis will be used to test whether adoption of gated traps will influence my 8 dimensions of well-being. And this is a good approach because it compares changes in outcomes over time. Now, finally, my 4th chapter, I will look at the relative advantage of escape slope traps and see how this gear will impact our ecosystem. Now, before I go into the details, it's good we put this into context again. Let us look at the concept of multi-species harvest. We all understand that gears are very selective. Fishermen using different gears will target different species of different sizes. Given that the escape slope traps would allow certain fish to exit through the gaps, that would certainly change the suite of target species. And that begs the question, will that change in species targeted be beneficial or detrimental? Because remember, fishermen are competing with, escape slope fishers will be competing with other fishermen for the same resource. And we wouldn't want, they wouldn't want to be sacrificial lambs. They wouldn't, want to end up in a situation whereby all the fish that they let go is actually captured by other fishermen operating within the same area. And again, for those of us who believe on climate change, we would also want to know whether those species that are retained, are they vulnerable to overfishing or climate change? So we would want to know the species or the functional groups that are targeted by gated traps or escape flow traps, whether they are vulnerable to both climate change and overfishing. And to do this, I will use the global fish catch data from the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Wait Institute. This data emanates from a number of countries, such as Tanzania, Madagascar, Kenya, and Kurawa. And I will apply the indices of fishing vulnerability and climate vulnerability to assess that. And in terms of climate vulnerability assessment, I have identified response to disturbance, diet specialization, habitat specialization, recruitment specialization, and other biological traits as contained in the marine biotic modules to assess climate vulnerability. When it comes to fishing vulnerability, I have identified the life history traits, fecundity, body size, spatial behavior, and geographical range. Now, information about these parameters will be derived from the literature, from fish base or other previous empirical assessments. Here I will use the t-test to test the mean vulnerability of catch between escape flow trap and controlled traps. The multivariate analysis will be used to determine similarity degrees between fish and gears. And canonical correspondence analysis will be used to detect relationships between fish community and gears. And this is a framework that Nix and others already developed, so I will also use their framing to show the combined effects of climate change and fishing pressure. That will be plotted in one graph, but instead of having functional groups like what we are seeing in this figure, I will put the fish targeted by different gears on these two axes. And finally, just to show interaction between fishing gears and functional groups, I will produce two Venn diagrams, one for fishing vulnerability and for climate vulnerability. Okay, regarding my expected outcomes for my study, for chapter 1, I will provide information that will help us determine the factors that will influence adoption of gear-based conservation initiatives in fishing villages. My second chapter will give us very critical information on the factors influencing the spread of gear-based conservation innovations in fishing communities. The third chapter will provide critical information on the effects of gear-based conservation innovations adoption on fishers' well-being. And finally, my fourth chapter will give us information on the ecological implications of gear-based conservation innovations in coral reef fisheries. Now, in terms of policy and implications and contributions, we know that fishers in most of the developing countries where many of the coral reefs are located would actually prefer gear-based management than complete closures. So we want to take advantage of that and provide very critical information that will help managers to better implement these gear-based management initiatives in poor developing countries. And the information on the implications of this gear on fishers' well-being will help managers to better reconcile the trade-offs between people's well-being outcomes and ecosystem conservation objectives. And then we will end up with very critical linkages between ecology and fisheries management based on my fourth chapter. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.